Hi, Michael.
Hi, Jen. How are you today?
I'm doing all right. Happy July.
Thank you very much. I'm glad that we are finishing up. We started this during Fair Housing Month in April, and it has been a really good ride. I think we've been spacing it out just about right, but it was a very good book overall. I'm very happy we could get through it.
So this is our last podcast.
On this book it is.
On this book,
Maybe we'll do something in the future.
God help them all. I want to know, Michael, just in general, what did you think about the book?
Well, I liked it. I thought it was very enlightening. And as you know, I've been professionally involved in fair housing issues. In the early 90s, I was the chair of the WRA Equal Opportunity Committee, and I've been teaching fair housing, new realtor orientation, since the mid-90s. So I've been doing this for quite a while. As an attorney, I was aware of a lot of the legislative and especially case law that address these issues, aware of some of the horrible decisions that have come out of some of the courts, including the Supreme Court, on these issues. But this book really opened my eyes to the major role that the government has played creating and maintaining segregation. Perhaps even more importantly, it's pointed out to me the long-term effects that segregation has had that can be very difficult to overcome. So I thought the book was very enlightening, and I enjoyed it very much.
I did too. For this last podcast, Michael, I mean, you and I have gone through, I think we very thoroughly went through the various chapters of the book. What I'd like to do for our final podcast is, moving forward, what do we have to say? What do we do with all of this that you and I both have learned from reading this book? I think in order to do that, I want to cover just a couple basic things, kind of laying the foundation of, do we agree that this is what we took from the books?
Okay.
For the first one, can we start with the agreement that the author has made the case for de jure segregation? Segregation that was a direct result from specific and deliberate government actions that violated the constitutional rights of African Americans for such a period of time that it created a significant and entrenched economic, social, physical, even in mental harm. Do you think that he did that in this book?
He did, and from the very beginning, he talked about de jure versus de facto segregation. De jure, of course, being government segregation. De facto just being that that's the way people act. Frankly, before reading the book, I probably would have been more inclined to think that de facto segregation was a greater impact than de jure. But he makes the point conclusively that de jure segregation is where it all begins. And that de facto, of course, is going to follow along those ways, but that de jure actions were primarily responsible and were the driving force that continued segregation well beyond what would have occurred naturally.
Yep.
I think that was, again, one of the major things that opened my eyes. But he makes the case very well.
Yeah.
That it's the government that has pushed this, it's the government that has sustained it, and the de facto just followed along those lines.
Yep. That's the first leg. Second leg of the stool. Can we agree that the harm incurred from the de jure segregation cannot be remedied simply by just stopping further action, such as other civil rights violations, restricting use of public space or employment, things of that nature, public uses? That segregation in housing is different because the harm that was created from discrimination in housing was different than other civil rights violations. Not just that it was incurred by a group of people in the past, but the harm of housing segregation has continued and was passed on for future generations.
Yes, we can agree to that. I think that we addressed that a little bit in one of our previous discussions about the fact that it's okay to say, gosh, now you can rent a motel room here. We're not going to discriminate against you based on your color or your race anymore. So now you can rent a motel room here where before you couldn't. Or you can eat in this part of the restaurant or in our restaurant. Or you can ride in this part of the bus versus that part. Those are simple changes that affect things. But the segregation and discrimination involved in housing has immense long-term effects, generational effects, as we've discussed previously. And I think that was an important part of the book, was discussing how the long-term effects of housing discrimination and segregation was much more impactful over the long run than some of the other areas where discrimination had occurred.
Okay, so that's the second leg of the stool. The third leg of the stool, before we can move on, is the question of, do we agree that although each of us today may not have personally participated in discrimination and the segregation of housing, when we talk about we are the collective, in that we are the government, and thus we have a responsibility to address and work towards some type of remedy of these constitutional violations that created generational harm for the African American community.
Yes, the first 3 words of the Constitution are we the people. And that's who we are. We are the people. We are the government. We are responsible for this. Not you and I personally, as you said, but as a group, the government is responsible for much of the harm that's being suffered still today. We do have to take some responsibility for this, to try to create a situation where the Black Americans that have been discriminated against can have an opportunity to catch up. Mm-hmm. And it's not going to happen overnight. There's no magic pill. There's no easy fix. But we have to start somewhere. And in fact, the author of this, Richard Rothstein, and his daughter, Leah, wrote a follow-up book to this several years later called Just Action, How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law. And by the way, the name of the book, Color of Law, is a remarkable name because of the fact that color is an important part of what we're talking about here, but also the color of law is a term that implies that we have some sort of legal support for what we're doing when in fact we may not really have it. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what's going on here. So I thought it was a very good title for that book. That I will be reading, whether we decide to do a podcast about Just Action or not, I will definitely be ordering that off of Amazon, reading it to see what their ideas are with regard to this. I think the biggest thing is, as realtors, we earn a living by going out and finding buyers and sellers to work with. And sometimes as a manager for many years in a real estate company, I had to help new agents figure out how they were going to do that. What I used to say to people sometimes is, do something. You have to do something. You can't sit in the office and wait for the phone to ring. You can't sit in the office and wait for people to come to you. You have to go out and do something. And I think that's where we are in this situation here. We have to do something. We can't just stand by and go, well, we're not doing that anymore, so it's going to be okay now. Because that's not the case. Yep. We're going to have to do something. Exactly what that's going to be, I don't know. And maybe you and I can talk a bit more about that during this podcast. But I think the main thing is we have to do something.
Yep. And I've heard this a lot. We are hearing it a lot even today. Kind of this mentality of, well, previous governments, previous people, previous generations did these things. I didn't do it. You were harmed. Too bad, so sad. Not my responsibility. And the author in the questions says, and I love this, we can't accept the privilege of U.S. citizenship that we haven't earned. You know, I never fought in a war. I didn't do the things that created freedom in this country. I didn't earn my citizenship here. I was born to it. So I can't accept that privilege of U.S. citizenship that I didn't earn and then refuse responsibility for remedying wrongs we didn't cause. Previously, in other podcasts, I also equated it, since we were in the real estate world, it's about as ridiculous as buying a house that has damage to it, that needs repairs, and saying, well, I'm not going to fix it. I didn't do the damage. Why should I have to fix it? Just because I'm the one who owns it now. Or no, I'm gonna sit around in a house that has, broken heaters or broken plumbing. No, we're going to have to figure out how to try and fix some things, whether we were the ones who broke them or not. Given that we agree on these 3 things, the question that I'd like us to spend our time on is then now what? Okay, so there was de jure segregation by the government that violated constitutional rights. There was enough harm that simply not doing it anymore isn't good enough. And we are the ones that are left holding the bag, so to speak. And we need to start figuring out, how do we start trying to repair things, paying down at least an enormous debt. Some of the things that the author had talked about both in the book, in the chapters, and hinted at them, and as well in the questions, is when you're looking just at the economic damage of loss of equity in home ownership. That also related to then limiting access to better jobs, better education. But how do we pay for it? Like, these are real dollars and cents that were lost here. It wasn't just we made Black people feel bad. we cost them economically. And so if we're going to try and remedy that in some way, how do we pay for it? What do we say to people who say they can't afford it? The author himself says that there is the concept that's floated out there that's called reparations, which he doesn't necessarily favor. He doesn't necessarily think that is the best route for us to go, whereas reparations is just a single one-time payment. And I agree with the author, just in the standpoint of not necessarily that that's not due, but the practicality of it and what is it really going to solve, in that I don't know if handing out checks is really going to accomplish the ultimate goal of raising the economic condition for generations now of African Americans and the damage that was done over decades. I think that the money, whatever money we do use towards this goal, has to be an investment that tries to raise the standard, level the playing field, so to speak. If you agree with that, like rather than getting us away from this idea of handing out checks, but making investments into programs, some of the ideas that the author talked about is whether it's like just in the realm of home ownership, tax credits or down payment assistance to help lower African Americans get into home ownership. Now, I'm talking about with sense. There's no point in putting anybody in a home that they're not going to be able to keep, but having programs that can help them get into home ownership so that they can build equity over time. What do you think about that?
Well, I think you've nailed it. I agree with you 100% that paying reparations, I think the city of San Francisco at one point talked about paying every African American in the city like $3 million or something. First of all, I don't know where the money's going to come from. But second of all, that doesn't really solve the problem. Mm-hmm. I can see investing that same amount of money into better school programs, better educational programs, better work technical assistance programs in terms of developing work skills so that people can have better jobs. And then when we switch over to home ownership, which is kind of what we're talking about because we're realtors, and, it's a realtor association, down assistance payment programs. NeighborWorks is a good program. It's not specifically geared towards African Americans. It's open to anybody. But that type of program, and I think along with that, you have to have that same thing that NeighborWorks requires, and that is if you're going to get the thousands of dollars of down payment assistance, you need to go to a class to learn how to take care of your home and how to be financially responsible.
The financial literacy component. The author even talks about the fact that how many African Americans were targeted and taken advantage of because they knew that they didn't necessarily understand how the lending and mortgage system worked.
And that continued into the 2000s. People were specifically targeted in 2006, 2007, 2008. In that period of time, there has been lawsuits and people have gone to jail. But education is going to be a good thing both in schools, et cetera, but also in learning how to take care of your home. I thought your analogy was really good. I have a house now. I didn't break the stuff, so I'm not going to fix it. No, you want to fix it. Now, if you ever saw me around a house, you know I can't fix everything at once. I might need some help doing it. But that's just it, though. You have to start somewhere. And that's what I said before. Do something. We have to move ahead and start somewhere. And I think that those types of programs, tax credits, nothing in the book was made up. Everything in that book was well documented.
History. Yep.
Documented. And they talk about the fact that African Americans were taxed on their homes at higher rates than white people were. That needs to be turned around. And I'm not saying tax white people higher than before. I'm saying I think we need to tax African Americans less, give them tax credits, give them advantage so that they can afford their home and that they are in fair programs, lending programs. One of the things that I found remarkable in reading the book was all my life I had thought of, and again, I wasn't born until 1950, and Roosevelt was president from the early 30s until the late 40s. But I always thought that he was like this progressive, liberal, he's like inclusive with every, and to read all these programs, especially FHA, to say, oh yeah, we're going to provide housing assistance. Oh no, not if you're black.
Not if you're black.
And to think that was still happening in the 1930s from our progressive, inclusive president with all these social economic programs that they were going together was a slap in the face to me to say, oh my gosh, I had no idea that these people were specifically excluded from benefiting from this. And that's why we need to specifically include them in programs today and offer them opportunities that they've never had before, including learning more about what's going on, additional training. Yeah. I don't think you can just give people money and make things better. Yeah. That's putting a Band-Aid on something that requires far more than a Band-Aid.
The author also did a good job. Although this is about housing discrimination, where you live or where you're not allowed to live impacts so many aspects of your life beyond your address. It impacted where African Americans were able to get jobs, trying to get to and from those jobs. And it definitely had a big impact on their schools and the education that they were able to receive. In that regard, when we're looking at types of remedy for this, the author talks about affirmative action for education and jobs and other quasi-government systems, which affirmative action has somehow become a four-letter word, even the state of Wisconsin. The argument comes up, well, that's just not fair. Affirmative action programs are not fair. They discriminate against white people. And so this is just my opinion. But in reading this book, it became very apparent to me that we the collective, took opportunity away from African Americans, not just to have equal access, but have access at all to a lot of things. And so now we will cry foul when affirmative action might take away a slot from a white person. I don't believe that we can even begin to fix this without it costing us something. It costs them something. There's a debt. You can't fix something with nothing. It's going to cost us something. If I put myself in those shoes and someone looks me squarely in the eye and said, Jennifer, you are not going to get this job. You are not going to get this slot in this university because we are reserving it for an African American. After reading this book, I don't think personally I could call that unfair, given the systemic and longstanding and historic unfairness that has been happening in this country for so long.
I don't like the concept of affirmative action taking something away from somebody that's white. I like the idea of affirmative action giving a person of color, particularly African Americans, because they've been discriminated against the most in this situation. In fact, that was something I thought was interesting about the Long Island study that Newsday did a few years ago now, where they found that African Americans were discriminated against 49% of the time, whereas Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans, much less, much lower. So even though there was discrimination across the board, it was much higher for Black Americans than it was for the other minority groups. I don't like the idea of saying, well, we're going to take something away from this white. I think we're just going to give a stronger opportunity for a Black person to fit in there. And if that means somebody else doesn't get in, that's fine. We didn't take it away from you. You just didn't qualify because we had to give additional consideration to someone because of their color. We had to give additional consideration to that. I'm okay with that idea, and I know the effect's the same. I just like saying we're going to be more inclusive as opposed to excluding people that are white. We're just going to be more inclusive of people who are not white.
Well, again,
maybe the effect's the same, but
we call that in the political world spin, Michael.
Yeah, I understand.
And it is a more positive way to look at it. I was trying to address head-on the argument that is made by people who don't want a positive spin on it.
I think we have to have affirmative action. And in fact, long before this book was written, and when I applied for law school in 1974, affirmative action was in place. And I only applied to 2 law schools. I got into one, and I got waitlisted on the other one. And the one I wanted to go to, I got waitlisted on. And frankly, at the time, and even today, I'm quite sure that without affirmative action, I would have gotten into that other school pretty easily. But neither at that time nor any time since have I felt that I got cheated, that I felt that it was inappropriate for that to happen. I didn't think that it was wrong then. I don't think it's wrong now. I think that we do have to provide that. But at the same time, I think that when we do that, just like we have to do with mortgage programs and down payment assistance programs and everything else, we can't just go, oh, okay, here's your seat at the law school. We have to give them additional assistance to help them make sure that they stay there.
Yeah,
if they stay there. If they need it. If they need it, we need to give them assistance that they can stay there. Because it doesn't do any good to open the door and not let them out and let them in the room and not tell them how the room works.
Right.
So I think we need, and that's why I need that extra money comes into play, where we need to use that money wisely to not just throw a Band-Aid on something. We need to fix it systemically, like you said before, to provide additional assistance to help people continue to be successful.
So we don't want to check a box. We actually want to create real change that lasts
Absolutely.
and has impact.
Absolutely.
And for those people, it's just, I find it so ironic, whether it's the cost, whether we're giving additional tax credits, whether, we get so hot and bothered. Let's take our industry alone. When we are seeing examples where government is taking private property. It's our mantra. Private property rights, no takings. And the minute it happens, even today, there's immediate court cases demanding financial remedy. Or how about just when the government overregulates private individuals or businesses and costs them money, costs them opportunity in business. No more of that. You're infringing on my rights. You're costing me something. Or how about when the government targets people? Here's one in our industry. Targets people for increased property tax assessments as soon as they sell their home. That's not fair. You're just taxing me more because I sold my home, and you're not taxing everybody with increases. We don't find it unreasonable when someone has been exonerated for a crime that they didn't commit and they get a government payment for wrongful imprisonment. We say to them, yeah, damn right, you just took away their life for the last 20 years. Yet, we cannot stand the idea of reparations or financial remedies for the constitutional violations of African Americans. We have no outrage for that.
If an African American has been wrongfully jailed, which has happened more than a few times, but it's been proven that it's been wrong and they've been released, then they should be entitled to the same sorts of reparations as anybody else would be entitled to, of course. But as I said a minute ago, you can't fix the long-term effects of the housing situation by giving somebody a lump sum of money.
No.
I think that it has to be an opportunity to get a head start on getting into the housing market now, not having artificial constraints on where you can live and being able to live wherever you can afford. As I say in my fair housing orientation class, fair housing is not just the law, it's good business to make sure that housing is available to everybody that's out there, and that no matter who's selling a house, that anybody can come and see the house, and if they can afford it, whether it be through assistance programs or whatever else, Section 8, or whatever else that might be out there, you should be able to live wherever you can afford. And we need to help people get into those positions because, as you said before, there were artificial constraints previously to them getting into these places, including zoning, which had an impact on that as well. And we need to remove those and give assistance to let people get into these situations today.
But here is my point, Michael. My point was that in white societies, primarily, people who have money, we have property, we have businesses, whatever it is, when our constitutional rights are violated, when we are wrongfully harmed, when we are given a financial burden wrongfully by government action, we will go to court and we will demand remedy. However we talk about remedy is a different matter, but I'm just saying there is outrage. We need to check government in what they're doing. But we just went through an entire book where there was the most egregious government actions that cost African Americans. And it feels for the most part there is, like I said, a lack of rage over that because it's not happening to us.
It's not happening to us. It's also not happening in our time frame.
Oh, well.
But it has happened in our time frame.
It's still happening in our time frame, but not to this degree.
But not to this degree. But it doesn't mean that we don't have to fix the house.
Exactly.
We do have to fix the house. But we can't fix it all at once necessarily. It's something that we have to address. And like I said, I'm anxious to read the book Just Action to see what kind of things Richard and his daughter Leah propose.
Well, let's talk about some of them. So one of the ideas that was brought up is how do we create more integrated neighborhoods moving forward? You're not going to have forced integration. That's not the way. But whether it's incentives and then the critics who might call that social engineering. I love how the author calls out the irony of individuals who are concerned with desegregation as social engineering when That's exactly what was done through government enacted policies to keep blacks separate and subordinate.
Absolutely.
Through restrictions on where they could live, where they could go to school, and what kind of jobs they held. If that's not social engineering, I don't know what is. Trying to have incentives to desegregate isn't social engineering. It is trying to undo the social engineering government did.
I totally agree with you. And I also agree with the fact that you can't force people to integrate. However, it needs to be available. And my experience, and again, my experience is limited to my own activities, and I'm just one person in a huge society. But my experience has been that if you make those opportunities available, many, if not most people, will avail themselves of it. And that's the whole point, is people should be able to live regardless of color or any protected class status, but particularly color and race. And race, of course, is always the super protected class because it goes back to the 1866 law saying you shall not discriminate on the basis of race with regard to housing. And even though the federal law had exceptions, ridiculous exceptions in some cases, race had no exceptions. There was no exceptions to that one. They should be able to live wherever they can afford to live, wherever they want to live. And again, I think as far as the afford part, that's the part where we need to make our reparations, so to speak, and I'm putting air quotes around reparations, where we can say we will provide you with tax credits, we will provide you with down payment assistance programs, and some education and some training on being financially responsible and being able to take care of your home. Like I said, I'm not particularly good at taking care of my house, or in terms of fixing things around the house and whatnot. Maybe some programs on that kind of activity as well. And that would necessarily have to be limited to people of color. It could be available, but available to everybody to take classes on maintaining your home and maintaining your equity in your property. But these are all programs that they need to be affirmative. Whether you want to call it affirmative action or not, they do need to have an affirmative aspect to them because we can't fix past wrongs by just standing by and saying, well, we don't do that anymore.
Well, there's also the aspect of letting people live where they want, and that is absolutely true. I agree with that. But I also believe that there are benefits of having more integrated neighborhoods.
Oh, I couldn't agree more.
And the problem is that's going to be hard to get because, well, as the book laid out, white people have been real mean to black people moving into their neighborhoods, and who would want to do that? It would take a significant amount of courage for a black family to want to be just an extreme minority and forging their way into that. And so until we start getting a little bit better reputation for how we treat minorities moving into areas that are primarily white, you're going to have to give a little bit of a bigger incentive to African Americans to achieve that integration that I think we all need in the long run.
My experience, again, as limited as it may be, although I'm pretty old now, so I've had years of experience, has been that if I was going to be raising kids today, I would want my kids raised in an inclusive environment. I would want them raised in a diverse community because I think that would make them stronger, better adjusted, possibly more likely to be successful in life. I don't think that homogenous society is good. I think you create severe limitations on capabilities for the future. I would want my kids to be raised in a diverse community. So
long as when they knock on their neighbor's door, they're not shot. So we got some hurdles to get over in that one.
We definitely do. But one thing I want to make sure that we all keep in mind is that discrimination is not something that only white people are guilty of.
No.
Discrimination it can be across the board. The last time, as a real estate broker, one of my agents came to me and said, oh my gosh, I had somebody come to say to me today, I was working with a buyer, and they said to me today, I don't want to live near any Mexicans. And it was an Asian buyer. So it's not always a white person discriminating against it. But you're right, with regard to black and white relationships, it hasn't gone well in many cases.
Here's the difference. No, we all have biases. We all have biases, and inevitably, everyone's going to experience discrimination in some format. The difference is that white people still are the majority in this country, and number two, we still hold the majority of power and influence and wealth. The author does address another thing, which is he looks at, and he has the courage to call out some of the downfalls of the Section 8 housing program, specifically that Section 8 vouchers tend to go into areas that are already primarily very segregated and economically depressed. And when we continue that, we're prolonging, rather than remedying and integrating, we're kind of prolonging past harms. And it's really not easily solved under any circumstance, but we're in the middle of a housing crisis with escalating numbers of people who are housing insecure or homeless. And so right now probably might not be the best time to even address this question, because, when you have people who have a choice between being homeless or having a Section 8 housing voucher back into a poor neighborhood, poor black neighborhood, I think majority of people are going to say something is better than nothing. But I do agree with the author that in the long run, we do have to make sure that with our good intention of Section 8 and making sure that people are able to have a place to live, that we are not perpetuating the revolving system where people can't get out of segregated, depressed areas, especially African Americans.
Totally agree. And Section 8 housing, I think, is one of those situations that was designed to be a good thing and hasn't necessarily been as good as they thought it was going to be because of the things that you just brought up. So revisions, it's another area where we can make revisions.
Yeah.
We don't have to reinvent it. We just have to make revisions so that it works better than it does presently.
Well, first you have to be cognizant of it in the first place.
That's what they always say. The first thing you have to do is admit you have a problem.
Yeah.
And then go on from there.
You brought up zoning. The author does speak quite a bit of the role of zoning in housing segregation. And so, not always, but the rule of thumb is if you have a problem, go back and look at the source. You're going to probably find at least a possible solution to the problem when you're looking at what caused it in the first place. And so he does speak quite a bit about inclusionary zoning, even mandatory inclusionary zoning. For those of you listening, that's when, for instance, you're doing an apartment building or you're doing a subdivision, a certain number of units are required to be set aside, whether it's for a certain income or it's for a minority, such as an African American person. But here's the thing that I actually struggle with mandatory inclusionary zoning. So we have some serious social hurdles, not just economic, but social hurdles in living together that we need to get over. And we're not over them yet. So if you have required inclusionary zoning, then I believe society, the collective we, need to pony up the money to hold those developers harmless for the loss in units or revenue, because there is inevitably going to be resistance at first. There's inevitably, we've seen it, going to be some maybe reductions in sales or lesser values for a project or a home or a unit as we are trying to integrate how we live together. I don't feel that it should be just developers and builders of today who should have to carry that debt on their shoulders. I think, like I said, having a system of funds that holds them harmless if we're going to require that. And then the other side of that coin, beyond mandatory inclusionary zoning, I think is the easier and lower hanging fruit, which is what we're all working on right now as an industry, and I'm working on every single day, and that's trying to eliminate all of the existing exclusionary zoning policies, all of the large lot requirements and the large square footage, and you have to have a certain amount of stone, and you have to have 3-car garages, and all of those things that add enormous cost. And at the end of the day, if we trace back to our history of what was the purpose of that, it wasn't to keep property base up. It was to keep, quote unquote, those kinds of people out of our neighborhoods and communities because they knew minorities would never be able to afford it. And then they didn't have to say, we don't want blacks. Their policies inevitably kept them out because of the economic circumstances they fabricate.
You're right about how zoning has been used as a pretense or a substitute for restrictive language in covenants. And as we talked about previously, Wisconsin recently passed a law allowing people to remove that language, not permanently remove it, but to take that language out, to acknowledge that language doesn't exist, doesn't apply anymore with regard to restrictive covenants and housing. But zoning took its place. Zoning said, well, we won't say this is for Caucasian only, or we don't want any people of color, et cetera. We'll just create a plat of land where the zoning is such that people, they're not be able to afford to get in here anyway. The problem was, of course, that once in a while they could. Mm-hmm. And then that's where the issues came, and that's where we had cross burnings in the front yards and things like that. That was not exclusive to the South in the 20s and 30s and 40s. That was happening still in Wisconsin in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s.
And today even. I'm battling with local units of government on these types of requirements. And getting rid of this stuff doesn't cost us a thing.
Many of the things we can do are just a matter of changing policies.
Mm-hmm. And attitudes.
And obviously you're not going to go back to a neighborhood of acre lots, 5,000 square foot minimum square footage. You're not going to go back and change those. But certainly moving forward, we can make sure that we're looking at smaller lots, more affordable sizes of homes, et cetera. That doesn't just affect black families, it affects everybody because we're all struggling with housing. Everybody's struggling with housing. But certainly it's going to have a disparate impact on a disparate positive impact. Just like previously those kinds of restrictions had disparate negative impacts, this will have a disparate positive impact on people of color because it will allow them to be more included.
Open up doors.
Well, we have open doors, exactly, open doors.
So another thing that the author addresses, Michael, in all of this is the question about, well, what about all the other minorities that have been discriminated against? And the author says she'd have to be an idiot to try and claim that African Americans are the only minorities who have experienced egregious discrimination in this country. But he does make this distinction. Other minorities, after World War II, experienced a quarter of a century of wage growth, averaging about 2.3% per year, elevating many of them into the middle class eventually. But since 1974, there's been no wage growth for African Americans working in those similar blue-collar jobs such as production and non-supervisory jobs. That is a distinction. There has been significantly more discrimination in the past, and it continues on at levels for African Americans that just, frankly, is different than it is. It's on a whole other level than it is for other minorities. And I have no idea why. A lot of this just escapes my understanding.
I agree with you that it can be somewhat baffling because I would think if there was any culturally based bias that approached what we had against black families and black individuals in the past, it would be with regard to Asian society. Horribly mistreated Asians in the early 1900s when they were mostly on the west side of the country because that was access. Working on the railway and working on different aspects. Obviously, there's large Chinatowns still in Los Angeles and San Francisco and things like that. If anything came close to being as discriminated as seriously, it would be them. But in today's world, they had the less discrimination. The Newsday article showed that they were only discriminated against 19% of the time, where African Americans were 49% of the time discriminated against. So how does that happen? How do they slide through and make it through the gains culturally and make gains economically?
Well, I'll tell you what people say, Michael, because I think this is a good segue. The author also kind of addresses this. Is again, it's our own biases and even racism. In those arguments, they'll hold up Asian Americans and even hold up Hispanic Americans and say, well, you know, they just work harder. They work harder and they make better decisions, which is why they're doing better and why they're not experiencing some of the things that the African American community is experiencing in getting out of poverty. They'll point to things like, look at all of the single African American mothers that are out there. That's why they're stuck in the ghettos. And the book talks about the war on drugs. So I just want to read something because I don't think I can even sum it up well enough as the author does. But here's something I want to share. The war on drugs, including the mass incarceration of young men and adolescent boys living in low-income African American neighborhoods, began in the 1970s. Current trends predict that as many as 1 in 3 African American men born today can expect to spend some time in prison during their lifetimes. Most for non-violent non-violent crimes. Considering this, it is surprising that the African American college graduation rate is high as it is. As Michelle Alexander reports in her important book, The New Jim Crow, young African American men are less likely to use or sell drugs than young white men, but they are more likely to be arrested for drug use or sale. Once arrested, they're more likely to be sentenced. Once sentenced, they're more likely to receive long jail terms. African American automobile drivers are no more likely than white drivers to change lanes without signaling, but they're more likely to be stopped by the police for doing so. And once they're stopped, they are more likely to be caught up in the penal system, including jail time for inability to pay fines. The Justice Department's investigation of Ferguson, Missouri, police practices found that African Americans were stopped by the police more frequently than whites. But of those who were stopped and searched, more whites were found to be carrying illegal drugs than African Americans. Imprisoning nonviolent offenders in low-income minority neighborhoods has multi-generational effects. Once young men leave prison, even after shortened sentences, and many are not short, they may have permanent second-class status. They're unable to vote. They often get evicted from public housing. They're ineligible for food stamps. Their family relationships are likely frayed, if not irreparably broken. Most companies won't hire them. Barred from legitimate jobs, they're exposed to further incarceration when they attempt to earn a living in the underground economy. It says higher single-parent rates in low-income African American communities mostly results from a shortage of marriage partners for young adult women, excessive incarceration, and joblessness of young black men bear responsibility. And those aren't excuses. We have the statistics. We're studying these things. We have been incarcerating young black men for nonviolent crimes, mainly under the banner of a war on drugs, breaking up families and further perpetuating generational cycles of poverty. But yet, Asian Americans and Hispanics are doing better economically because they just work harder.
What you just talked about is going to have an indirect influence on the housing segregation, and the housing segregation has a direct influence on the things that you're talking about there. But it's another area, of course, where we need, if we're going to be spending money, which we should be, it's another area we need to spend money on, and that is making sure that you don't have racial profiling with the police departments and that people are not stopped. You know, you've heard the saying, what was your crime? Driving while black or walking while black in a neighborhood.
Do you know what it costs to incarcerate someone these days?
I just saw a number the other day, I don't know how accurate it was, but they said it's $30,000 a year per person.
For selling drugs.
Yeah, and they said it doesn't matter what they're in jail for, but
that's what it costs.
$30,000 a year per person is what it's costing us as society. The more often we send them back, and the longer we keep them there, the more it's costing us. So the cost is significant. And I agree, nonviolent crimes should not be, you shouldn't get off because you're white and not get off because you're black.
Well, there's definitely a disparate impact in our criminal justice system. And again, if we use the word investment, because it's costing all of us, even if you don't care about the injustice, you don't care about the African American community, if we can get people to even care about their pocketbooks and understand the math, that if they took all that money that we're spending on incarceration and started investing it in education and job training opportunities and getting people out of these severely economically depressed neighborhoods and providing more opportunity to them, we would actually be saving all of ourselves a tremendous amount of money.
And we do have the most incarcerated people in the world.
In the world.
In the United States, China's number 2.
Last question. How do we address any of this or make changes when most people are not even aware of this history? The book outlined how the majority of our American history textbooks do not include any of this information. And now we have a political system that is trying to fight against having it taught in schools, will not recognize systemic racism that exists in this country, A researcher, the book says, for reparations reported that 64% of white Americans think that the legacy of segregation is either minor or not a factor at all. He references like a collective amnesia. You have to have known something to have amnesia. I think it's more just stubborn ignorance. But the truth is, if you don't know the truth, if you don't know basic facts, and you're white, and you're living with all the privilege that comes with it, why would you think segregation or continued discrimination in this country even is a problem at all?
Well, the first thing that we should do is make everybody listen to our podcast.
Or at least read the book if you can't bear the podcast.
Well, and I would encourage anybody to read the book, get the book and read it. When we first started reading this book, I was visiting my daughter and her husband over in Rice Lake, Wisconsin. And when I mentioned I was doing a podcast in the book Color of Law, and I was reading this book, my son-in-law, who is a sociology professor for UW-Eau Claire and also for the technical college that's there, both those facilities, he said, "Oh, Richard Rothstein?" I go, "Yes." He goes, "Oh, is this it?" And he pulls it out. He's got it. He goes, "Yeah, it's the next book I'm going to be reading too." But that's just because it's part of his sociology class and because he's interested in those kinds of things. The book it does make an impact. The book is available. The book is worth reading and going
well
into.
Researched.
And he does a great job. And he's not black. He's a white 85-year-old male that did this because he felt that it's something that it was a story that needed to be told.
Well, he couldn't ignore the facts. They were just there.
And as I said, you can't ignore it. And he decided, I have to do something. Mm-hmm. And he and his daughter Leah wrote a follow-up, as we talked about before, called Just Action. The first thing we have to do is, like you said before, realize there's a problem. That's the issue right now is there's too much revisionary history going on. There's too much, we don't need to know about that. Why bring up bad things? Why talk about bad things? And maybe they've forgotten what people have been saying, legitimately been saying for many, many years, and that is those who don't know history are destined to repeat it. And you have to learn it. You have to learn from your mistakes. Our parents told us that. You need to learn from your mistakes, young man. I don't know if your parents did, but my parents said that to me.
Well, they didn't call me young man.
No, they didn't call you a young man. But they said you have to learn from your mistakes, and we have to learn as a society. We have to learn from our mistakes, and we can't learn from our mistakes if we cover them up. If we don't discuss what they are. I don't remember what Al Gore's book was called, An Uncomfortable Truth or something like that. It was about climate change.
Climate change, yep.
But that title could certainly be used in this capacity as well. It is an uncomfortable truth. Reading the book may be uncomfortable.
Yeah. For those people who don't bother me with the facts.
Yeah.
Do you have any final thoughts on the book, Michael?
My final thoughts on this are, I'm glad we did this. I said early on, I didn't even know what a podcast was, but I'm glad that we did this. I think that because it's such an important subject, talked a lot about the different things that were going on. We discussed it in maybe more depth. I don't know what a normal podcast is, but I know that we went into good depth on this one. Hopefully we didn't scare people off from it. I wouldn't mind doing a podcast with you again in the future on important issues. I thought it was very enjoyable. And also, I like the fact that I was forced to read something that perhaps I wouldn't have read on my own, but realized that this was an important aspect, and it's something that's going to affect me and my outlook on life forever. Mm-hmm. Forever. Opened my eyes, as I said, I started out today's podcast by saying I found it very enlightening, and I found that it was enlightening in not a comfortable way. These were uncomfortable truths. These were things that I thought, I knew some of this. I did not know close to all of it. I would have said de facto segregation was a more important part than de jure segregation, although I knew that existed to a certain extent. But to see the vast extent that de jure segregation had on the impact on African Americans as recently as this century, it was mind-boggling. You asked me this question before, and that was, will this affect how you teach orientation to realtors? And yes, it will. I only have an hour to talk, so I have a limited time to talk about this. But I have already taught that class once since I started this book, and I've made some adjustments, and I will be making additional adjustments in the future so that we discuss some of the more relevant aspects today when I'm talking to the new realtors with this regard. Assuming, of course, they allow me to continue teaching orientation.
I'm sure. So I agree with you, Michael. I am glad I read the book, and it taught me a tremendous amount and opened my eyes to things that I did not realize. As far as my final thoughts go, so this is my heart. There are a lot of people that still say that African Americans need to just get over it already. And it's so easy to say. But another way of saying that, if you even want to put a positive spin on it, is say, well, they need to forgive. And I don't disagree with that. I don't think anybody can move forward from something without forgiveness. But here's the problem I have with that. That puts the burden back on them. Because really, they're the only ones who can make the decision whether they're going to forgive or not. This is the problem. Even if they did. I'm tired of living in a country, it's 2024, that is still so racially divided, where there is still, after all this time, so much anger and hatred and violence, and still continued discrimination. What I want is more. I want reconciliation. I want restored relationship between African Americans and white Americans. And everything I've been taught, there are some really, really important elements for reconciliation, for a restored relationship. And you have to have all of them. And one is, like you said, there has to be recognition. You have to own this happened. Whether you did it or someone else did it, you have to own this is the truth and this is what happened. The next thing is there has to be some level of repentance. You have to, even if you didn't do it, you have to say, that was wrong. That was wrong and I am sorry. I'm sorry this happened. It shouldn't have been. It shouldn't have happened. There has to be regret over it. Expressed regret over it. The third thing is there has to be some kind of atonement. There was a debt. There was a harm done. There's a debt owed. And we may not be able to really ever pay that back. We talked about that. It's so enormous. But you have to do something. You can't say, oh, well, if someone cost you something huge and they made no effort to make it right, how do you move past? How do you have reconciliation? And then the final thing is there has to be a commitment to not reoffend. If someone pokes you in the eye and they say they're sorry, and then they turn around and you watch, they poke you in the eye again, everything they've done and said doesn't really mean much, does it? So until we start taking real action to stop in our system, in our society, in our neighborhoods, in our places of employment, in our schools, we stop committing these same mistakes over and over and over again, we will never have restoration of relationship between African Americans and whites. And the anger and the hatred and the misunderstanding and even the violence will never be remedied. Generations from now, they'll still be talking about all of this. And I don't want that. I don't want it anymore, and I don't want it for future generations. And so these are the things. I don't just want African Americans to get over it. I don't want them to even just have to forgive and have that be on their shoulders alone. I want reconciliation. I want restoration.
Well, the other thing about that too, Jen, is I've told my kids this a long time ago. I said, you can't say, anytime you say, I'm sorry, but you've just taken I'm sorry off the table. We can't say, I'm sorry this happened, but I didn't have anything to do with it. I'm sorry this happened, but they didn't know it. They didn't know any better. I'm sorry this happened, but anytime you add that but, then there's no more sorry. And you're right. We have to be. We have to own up to it. We have to say we have to recognize that it happened, and we have to say we're sorry that it happened, and let's see what we can do to fix it. It's not going to be an easy task, but I'm going to say the nerdiest thing I've said in a long time. Okay. Lord of the Rings, which is
okay. All right, go ahead.
Lord of the Rings. I read Lord of the Rings in the 70s, so I'm not a Johnny come lately when it comes to this. I read Tolkien in the 70s, in the early 70s.
Very good friends with C.S. Lewis.
Yes, he was, absolutely.
Who wrote the trilogy Chronicles of Narnia.
Exactly, as well as Alice in Wonderland as well. But one of the things I took away And my copies of Lord of the Rings, my paperback copies of Lord of the Rings, look a lot like your book, Color of Law, with notes in the margins and things underlined and different things, because I took a lot away from that as a young hippie in my early 20s. I took a lot away from it.
It's an allegory.
One of the things that stayed with me is the longest journey begins with a single step. And unless we make that first step and move in that direction, we're never going to get there. And that's why I said before about you have to do something, because this will be a long journey, but we have to take the first step.
Yes. It's your actions that show your heart in the end. And even if we can't pay this debt back, watching our society try to do something to correct the injustice, I think would go a long way towards repairing and restoring.
Absolutely. As one final thought on my behalf, as realtors, we need to be an integral part of that solution.
We do.
Thanks,
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody who's listening. Take care.